Peace, family. It's good to be back. Let's get this work in. Today, we want to talk about George H.W. Bush from a black man's perspective. Now, unless you've been somewhere under a rock, you've seen all of the media reports surrounding the passing of George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States of America. And for the past week or so, we've had to literally stomach all of these flowery and wonderful things that they've had to say about Bush 41. Talking about what a statesman he is, talking about what an ambassador he was, what a servant of the masses he was, and how he ended the Cold War. But this brings to mind a quote from the great Malcolm X. Malcolm said that the media is the most powerful entity in the world. They can make someone who is evil look as if though they are good. They can make someone who's guilty look innocent. They can make someone who's innocent look guilty. And so what we've been seeing is a well thought out and a well executed plan to scrub the legacy of George H.W. Bush to ensure that he is remembered in a way that is not reflective of the impact that he actually had on the world. Now, you see many comparative analysis between George Bush and Donald Trump since Bush's passing. And people are basically giving George Bush a pass simply because he's not like Trump. But in certain instances, I will go as far as saying that George W. Bush, H.W. that is worse than Donald Trump. Maybe not in his presentation, but when you look at the policies of George H.W. Bush, he was Trump times 10. For Donald Trump is a known white nationalist. But George H.W. Bush was not a white nationalist. He was what I call a globalist with his white supremacy, and his program of what was called a New World Order was really make America great again on steroids. We want to talk about George H.W. Bush from a black man's perspective. Now, Mr. Bush was born into a very powerful family. But this was a family who literally made its money off of war. One of the very corporations that benefited most from the Desert Shield Gulf War that George H.W. Bush started was a company called Halliburton. And many people don't know that I think it was Bush's grandfather who was one of the founders of the company that merged with Halliburton. See, that is how far back his family goes in making money off of wars. And so the blood that was shed in that war ultimately turned into a financial gain, not just for the Bush family, but for all of the neocons who were with him. This New World Order thing, it was make America great again on steroids. George Bush is famous for a line that he said on national television. And this is where I come into the part about speaking from a black man's perspective. He once appeared on national television with a baggie of crack cocaine. And he convinced the American people that that bag of crack cocaine had been confiscated from a black male at Lafayette Park across the street from the White House. And he said, we need more jails, we need more prisons, we need more courts, We need more prosecutors. Now, what they didn't tell you was that the young black male who was found selling drugs across the street from the White House was actually lured there by White House operatives. They sent an informant to him and convinced him to come to that particular park to sell his drugs. And it was a trip because the young man who lived in Washington, D.C., he didn't even know where the White House was. So he goes and he tries to sell his drugs, a sting. He gets caught up in it. And, you know, obviously they set him up and they used him as a prop to pass a $1.5 billion bill that would increase police on the streets, increase the building of prisons, and fluff up what was quoted as or called the war on drugs, which really was a war on black people. George H.W. Bush did this. Now, he also ran a campaign on the back of a black man by the name of Willie Horton. Willie Horton was a black man out of, he's out of Massachusetts. And George Bush and his handlers, they made this commercial about this brother named Willie Horton, who had been allegedly given a pass to come home from prison on the weekend, a furlough, and he allegedly killed some white woman. Well, the same way Donald Trump uses dog whistle politics and dog whistle rhetoric to speak past black people and the rest of America and speak right into the hearts of racist America, they went over and over and over again about this man named Willie Horton. And they said Michael Dukakis wants to give furloughs on the weekend to people like Willie Horton. There's this black man. And they create this scenario of him having robbed this and killed this white woman. And he used this racist tactic in his campaign. There was no shame in George H.W. Bush's game when it came to racism. So you expect me to shed a tear for Mr. Bush? I think not. Now remember, Bush has his roots in the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. When you go down the line of leaders of nations that were murdered by the CIA during his tenure, you'll begin to see some of the blood that was on Mr. Bush's hands. As a matter of fact, once the Cold War ended, many of those CIA operatives who had been assigned to Russia and that area were brought back to America. And from research that was given to us in the Nation of Islam, many of those agents were sent to Los Angeles to infiltrate the gangs. So much of the killing that we saw in the early 90s in Los Angeles and other places across America, much of that were the results of those gang wars being agitated by those that Mr. Bush brought back to this country. Now, this war on drugs, and if you're familiar with the Iran-Contra scandal, if you're not, please go and look it up. I really don't have time to go all, into it. But Mr. Bush was one of the main players. As a matter of fact, he quarterbacked this whole thing where arms were being sold to Iran to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. And if you study the life of Freeway Ricky Ross, who did lots of time in prison for selling drugs, he was an operative of Nicaraguan drug dealers who were allowed to pour crack into urban neighborhoods in California and across America, which ultimately, perpetuated this war on drugs, which was really started by Reagan. It perpetuated the war on drugs. George Bush quarterbacking this thing. Now, understand, I was born in the 70s. So I know what the black community was like during that period of time. I literally watched my community disintegrate after the introduction of crack cocaine into the community, and all of a sudden these designer powerful weapons that we were using against one another in the drug game and during gang warfare. I remember the black community in Houston before all of that was a reality. And you remember, I remember seeing the corner home that was just a regular family's home. One year it was a residential home. 2 years later, it's a crack house. I saw it happen. So I witnessed, unlike those who may have been born in the late 80s or the 90s, I witnessed the degradation of the black community due to the influx of drugs and guns into our community. And if George Bush was a main operative, a main catalyst to make this happen, what do I look like shedding tears for Mr. Bush? Now, let me say this. I'm not one to make mockery of death. And it is a natural instinct for people not to want to speak ill of the dead. I respect the angel of death. You know why? One day I'm going to have to meet him. One day I will have to meet the angel of death. So I don't play games when it comes to that. But at the same time, it turns my stomach to see us tap dancing, hemming and hawing and standing at attention. Why? Because ABC, NBC, CNN, and CBS told you to? You better have a mind of your own. And again, Malcolm said it best. The media has the power to make the guilty look innocent and the innocent look guilty. And trust me, they're making George H.W. Bush look innocent, and he's absolutely guilty. Now, let me tell you another reason that I believe that I have the right as a black man to reserve my tears. I'll cry for a dead dog on the side of the road before I cry for George H.W. Bush. That's just the way it is. I have a right to reserve my tears. And I'll spend my tears where I believe that they are, where it makes sense. The Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm and Operation Desert Shield. We must remember that Saddam Hussein was once an operative of the United States of America. And he was tricked into thinking that if he invaded Kuwait, that America would have a hands-off approach, because that is what they told him. So the pretext for war in 1991 was just as much of a lie as it was when George W. Bush, his son, invaded Iraq in the 2000s. They were told that Saddam Hussein had tens of thousands of troops at the Kuwaiti border about to invade. It turned out later to be a lie. And a young lady came on television. She said that Kuwaiti babies were being thrown to the ground in hospitals and being stomped out by some of Saddam Hussein's army. This was on national television in America, so they were ginning up the American public emotionally and boiling their emotions up into a fever pitch to give him, George H.W. Bush, permission to go in and invade Kuwait. How do you know, Brother Deric? I know because at that time, okay, trying to get out of a drug ravaged, crack ravaged, dangerous community that I watched disintegrate during the war on drugs, I was trying to get the hell out of the community, and I joined the U.S. military, the United States Marine Corps, okay? I was in the Marine Corps in 1991. I was one of the persons who was sent to Iraq under the pretext that Saddam Hussein was slaughtering Kuwaiti babies. I remember sitting in a room with about 100 or so Marines, and they'd invited this really charismatic staff sergeant to come in to give us a presentation on what was happening in the Middle East. Big guy, white guy. Matter of fact, he was of Middle Eastern descent himself, but he was very well spoken. And I mean, he could sell ice to an Eskimo, real talk. And I remember him showing us as soldiers the pictures. There were photos of a long bayonet. A bayonet is a rifle that protrudes out of the barrel of a rifle. And they had a little baby on the end of the rifle, basically selling to us the story that this is what Saddam's men was doing to thousands of babies in the Middle East. Now, any decent human being who saw a photo like that would be ready to go and fight. This is the way they program the soldiers, okay? Now, did I believe it? At the time I did. I have to be honest. Why did I believe it? I believed it because at that time I was so naive that I did not believe that anyone would be wicked enough to lie about something like that. But I was deceived. So we flew into Iraq, and we were there for not long because the war ended before it could really get started. But I lost many of my friends in that war. Not many, but I lost some of my friends in that war. And it was a very traumatizing time for many of us. There's nothing like landing in a combat zone and waking up the next morning and hearing bombs fall over your head, not knowing whether or not you'll ever return to your family. I went through this on the orders of George H.W. Bush. I need somebody in the comment sections to go and tell me why it is I should be shedding tears behind this man's dying. Now, when we were over in the Middle East, America dropped some 88,000 tons of bombs on the Iraqi people. They bombed civilian facility after civilian facility. And in one particular facility, over 400 civilians were murdered, and they knew that these were civilians that were being killed. See, this is the kind of blood that George H.W. Bush had on his hands when he died last week. Tell me why we as black people should be shedding any tears for the 41st president of the United States of America. It is estimated that over 158,000 people died over there in the Middle East in the first Gulf War. And I remember seeing the videos of the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan and the First Lady of the Nation of Islam, Mother Khadija Farrakhan, walking through the hospitals in Iraq, shedding tears over the suffering of the children of Iraq years after the war had ended, and to this very day, you still see death hovering over Iraq. I'm not saying that you see it, but what I'm saying is the Iraqi people are still suffering from what was done during the administration of George H.W. Bush. So when I look at what the war on drugs did to the black community, and when I look at the black men who died in the Iraqi war, and I look at George H.W. Bush's history in American intelligence, and I think about Fred Hampton and how his organization was infiltrated, the Black Panthers were infiltrated by American intelligence, and all of the dirty, low down, evil, demonic things that have been done to us with George H.W. Bush at quarterback, I'd be damned if I shed a tear. Peace.